Join me in welcoming Aaron Lewis, AIA, and Matthew Griffin, AIA.
We're going to adjust some things up here really fast. I think so. If I have to, I'll stand on my tiptoes. But I think you guys can see, right? This is working. Because we're going to be switching off, it's going to be too funny if we have that platform there. So bear with us. Yeah. Yeah. Anyway, thank you guys so much for having us here. It is a true honor to come to you from Raleigh. And many thanks to John and Brandon and Michael who took us around showing us your amazing city. This is my first time to Knoxville, and I can honestly say I am jealous. And now get to go back to Raleigh and feel kind of bad that we don't have a river or a public library or a theater, lots of things, but lots of opportunities for us to bring back to our city. Anyway, so as John said, I'm Erin, this is Matt. Half of our office is here today. We are a very small office. So I do want to mention the folks in our office who are not here, which are Jake and Zach. They're holding down the fort for us back in Raleigh. But again, thank you so much for having us. We're super excited to be here.
And this is kind of a new talk for us. We are a fairly young firm. We've been doing this for just over 8 years. The talks we've given up to this point have really focused on the process of making a firm and being young and what that kind of starting out felt like. For us, now that we're both 40, unfortunately, and we've have a kind of log of work behind, under our belt, we are taking the opportunity with this talk to kind of be a little more reflective and talk to you about what it's been like to practice in Raleigh, North Carolina, to do the kind of work we do. And hopefully in the process you'll learn more than just about our work. In fact, we're not going to show project after project after project. This is going to be more of a story about our practice, and you'll see our work kind of scattered throughout. And we hope you learn a lot about Raleigh and some of the other great things going on there as well, since many of you probably have never been there. We're also excited about this talk because we're getting to give it 4 times in 2 weeks. We're calling these the Deep South lectures, even though Tennessee's not super deep south. But we're giving more lectures in the next 2 weeks than we've really given in the last 8 years. After this, we're headed down to Jackson to talk at Mississippi State. Which is going to be really fun. But the thing about the places we're going is last week we spoke in Little Rock and Hot Springs, Arkansas. Today we're speaking in Knoxville, obviously, and then on Thursday we're speaking in Jackson, Mississippi. All of the places we're talking are kind of mid to small-sized southern cities, and I think a lot of the things we're talking about today are going to be things that are common to the practices that people in those cities also face. If you noticed on the first slide, we're organizing the talk around 3 words, made, modern, and make-believe. And what we're going to do is just look at each of those words through different lenses as a way to organize what it's been like to practice in Raleigh.
So in addition to us being excited about our Deep South talks for the intensity that we're experiencing over these next 2 weeks, we both have connections to 2 of the places. Matt spent a lot of his youth in Arkansas, and I spent a lot of my youth. I actually grew up, as John mentioned, in a teeny tiny town in Mississippi called Yazoo City, Mississippi. It's the gateway to the Delta. Has anybody been there to Yazoo City? 1, 2 people? That's amazing. So this is an aerial. I always love this. I have a huge nostalgia for the place, even though I don't get back there very often. But I think it's important, as Matt and I were reflecting and putting together this talk, and it occurred to us all in the office, actually, all 4 of us spent a lot of our formative years in teeny tiny towns, either in North Carolina, Arkansas, Mississippi, et cetera, which is pretty unique. And so we didn't really think about that until we all sat down and started talking and realizing that when that happens, you become somebody who you're sort of forced to find beautiful things in a way that these things aren't necessarily in your face. When you grow up in a tiny town, you really have to search for these things. And what that has meant for us in our practice as architects has been pretty interesting, and we're only at the beginning of figuring out what that means. But it's a pretty special experience to have grown up in such a small town and now practice in a probably medium-sized city.
My childhood before I started college really was pretty different than Aaron's. Instead of living primarily in one place, I lived in a lot of places. My parents are both academics, and in this slide you can see images of places everywhere from Boston, Massachusetts to Batesville, Arkansas. Needless to say, Batesville, Arkansas is really different from Boston, Massachusetts. But this same kind of sensibility of observing things and learning about places was something that was really important for me as a kid, mainly as a act of survival more than anything else. Moving to so many different places, you kind of have to get to know places pretty quickly. And this is something that still kind of exists in me today. Since we've been in Knoxville, I think we've probably walked about 12 miles. Seeing the whole city last night when we first got here, after dinner last night, and then again this morning, really just kind of walking around and seeing the whole place. But in the end, I ended up in this little tiny town for high school called Batesville, very similar to Yazoo City, except for the topography, which is a little hillier. It was a small southern river town. And in places like this, everything makes sense. Little towns like that work more like cities than cities do these days in a lot of ways. You always know where the river is. You always know where you are in relation to that. And every building really serves a purpose. And you're able to find really beautiful things in a pretty quiet place if you look carefully. So the first word we're going to talk about today that we think is a theme in our practice is the word made. North Carolina, like a lot of southern states, just recently became an urban state for the first time, meaning more than half the people live in a city. For the first time in the history of the state. And so because of this, even a short distance outside of our city, we are constantly aware of the made, of buildings that were designed and built by the people who will use them. And these are really simple buildings, but they always have a couple things in common. They usually have a very clear sensibility about how they provide shelter, what they do with light, what they do with water, how they relate to topography, and a sense of kind of sighting and arrival that we always notice. These three buildings in this image are very important buildings to us. The one on your left is an outdoor church that was built in the 1830s that's right off the highway, Interstate 40, and we literally stop every time we drive by to the western part of the state. In the middle is a little corn crib on a site we're working on in Durham that thankfully we're able to keep, and it's kind of a marker of the entrance. And on your right is a small church in the mountains near a site we worked on recently. We try to think about these same things in our work. We try to think a lot about orientation, about lifting the buildings that we design off the ground to keep them dry, about admitting wind and natural light, which really requires us to think a lot about orientation. The two images here, the one on the left is of the Corbett residence, and on the right is of the Stimmel residence, which is still under construction. One of the things about this lecture is we'll see the Corbett residence again, and you'll be seeing a lot of pictures of things that are still in process. We really kind of wanted to capture where we are right now. We also are really interested in how buildings can kind of hide in plain sight. This is an image of the Taylor residence down near Charlotte, which is nestled in the trees to the north of a pond that existed on the site. And one of the most important things in our practice is we try really hard to understand the places we're working in and to do nothing to damage the best things that already exist on the site, and instead occupy the site with a building near those things and make a feature out of them. We're also really interested in how a building can reveal itself at just the right time and have the least amount of impact on the site that it possibly can. This is another image of the Corbett house. The moment when you come down the driveway and first see the house, at kind of this quartering view, understanding where you'll be parking, the kind of volume of the house, and you can see the entry. We also cited it so that at this moment, when you first see it, your eye is lined up right with the coping in the house, which is incredibly long and flat, really serves as a horizon in an otherwise hilly landscape. And then also how buildings can be lifted off the ground and relate to the topography, and how a material palette and color palette can grow from the site. In this case, with a house named Fred, this is a house that's completely metal clad. It has a standing seam metal for both the roof and the wall. That verticality really, for us, echoed the kind of vertical linearity of the trees, and the color palette was taken from kind of the color of the site. It's also a really interesting project for us because our clients were pretty unusual people. They really are very shy, private people. And the house on your right, that's the entry side of the house. As you move towards the left and lift off the ground, you actually move towards this completely private view of Duke Forest, which is a permanent reserve that their property looks out over.
Also being made right now is actually the city we live in. This is an image of Raleigh that's pretty recent, taken from what's about to become the biggest park or most important park in the state. Dorothea Dix used to be a mental hospital. But yeah, this is downtown. It's super exciting to be practicing architecture in one of the fastest growing cities in our nation. And most of that is because it's not sure what it wants to be. It knows what it was and what it was originally designed for, which was a capital city, but very small, so very small infrastructure. But with this explosion of growth, it really hasn't figured out what it wants to be. So a lot of what is going up right now is kind of ugly and generic, and we'll touch on that in a bit. I think a lot of American cities are suffering from that right now, but we are kind of bucking against that norm in our practice, and so are a lot of our colleagues who are doing the same thing. Raleigh's population is about 460,000 right now, and when I moved there in 2002, it was only just over 300,000, so growing really fast. So while it's being made, we're actually also having the opportunity to help make some of the cooler spaces in Raleigh. For example, on the left is an image of Raleigh's only mezcal bar, and it happens to have, in my opinion, the best hot dog in the city, believe it or not. I know it doesn't match, but trust me, if you're there and try it, it will. And also another favorite spot is Jubala Coffee. That is located just outside of downtown and next to NC State's campus. Also one of the favorite spots for coffee. We've also had the opportunity over the years to create or help our city create new types of housing, believe it or not. The row houses or townhouses, which you see on the left, are not a very common housing type right now, but we're in desperate need of more for density, beginning to address that in the built form. And that's a project we worked on. It's called the 10 at South Person. It's 10-unit townhouses that are located on the same street as our office, about 7 or 10 blocks away. And then on your right is a new type of worship space that we've had the opportunity to help make. This is located in the heart of downtown. It's called Church on Morgan Street. And it actually used to be a garage and now is a worship space. We basically turned the main space into the building into a sanctuary. We've even had the opportunity or created the opportunity for ourselves to make new typologies in our city. Starting to see this probably even around Knoxville, but a lot in Raleigh where people are sharing spaces. Different uses are being shared under the same roof. And our office is one of those spaces. We're located just north of downtown in an up-and-coming neighborhood, a small commercial area that historically supported a couple of these neighborhoods. And we have a storefront, and we're kind of shy people, and so we'd rather hide behind books. And we also think it's more responsible to have a better storefront that allows people to come in off the street and not just stare through the window at architects clicking away at their computers and things like that. So yeah, we share our office with a bookstore, which is really great to have a little bit of a distraction in each day and also feel like we're giving back to our community. And we also have the opportunity to remake forgotten things. This is an example of, we do a fair amount of renovations in some of our older neighborhoods. This is in a historic overlay district, so we were really only able to focus on, at least in terms of breathing new life into the building, in the rear. So this is a before picture. And this is actually for some restaurateurs who we had the opportunity to work with a few years before on their restaurant, and just a couple blocks away, they bought this house. So it's been quite a pleasure, like I said, to breathe new life into these old structures as well. We do a fair amount of ground-up construction, residential and non-residential, but the renovations are really, we have a soft spot in our heart for those.
One of the other remarkable things about our city is the community of designers and makers that live and work there. A lot of this has to do with the fact that we do have the NC State College of Design in downtown Raleigh. It's been there since the late 40s, so I guess 70 years now, which is a long time. And the school, from its very beginning, had pretty much every design discipline in it. Industrial design, graphic design, landscape architecture, architecture, of course, art and design, textile design. There's just a range of things all in one school. And as a result, there are a lot of people in our community who are doing great work. This image here is an image on the left of a fifth-year review and on the right of a second-year graduate studio review. We pretty much in our office all teach. All four of us have a relationship to the school and are on juries on a regular basis. None of us are full-time faculty. We teach on an adjunct basis, usually teaching a studio a year. But this process of engaging younger architects and students and helping them understand the role of making and how that affects design is something that's really important to our office. Because of the school, we do have people in all disciplines doing amazing work in the city. On the left are Sarah and Victor Litvinenko, who founded Raleigh Denim. So we have people doing things as unusual as making jeans, who are College of Design graduates. And on the right are Van and Van Visa Nolintha, who are the folks who owned the renovation house that Aaron just showed. They're incredible restaurateurs, have founded two Laotian restaurants in downtown Raleigh. But this kind of range of creativity of people in all fields is something that is creating a ton of energy in our city. And of course, we've seen that in Knoxville as well, the 2 times I've been here. A lot of these folks are also in building-related fields. There are 2 offices in particular that we work with a lot who are doing incredible work. On the left is an image of one of the folks at Arrowhead who are fabricators but also architects themselves, and we've collaborated with them a number of times. And on the right, folks from Tactile Workshop. These offices are doing incredible fabrication work and have been collaborators of ours. Those collaborations have really started to affect our work to a large extent. On the left here is the image of the skylight in Gallo Polone, which is the Mezcal restaurant that Aaron mentioned earlier. In that picture, you can see that steel beam, and there's a large sliding panel that actually shuts off part of the bar during lunchtime hours. And those sorts of things which, architects love to draw and don't always have the bandwidth to figure out are the sorts of things that, in this case, Tactile Workshop has helped us with. Also, the railing in a house that's just recently been finished called the Martignoni House. And these collaborations have really allowed us to investigate materials, depth, tectonics in a way that we otherwise would not have been able to do. The images here are of the Kimball residence, which is a house that also was just finished. Our clients just moved in and are loving it so far. But a lot of these fabrications were also made by a Tactile Workshop. And for us, it's really allowed us to push the limits of customization really in a pretty tame setting. We don't have projects that have gigantic budgets, but because we have great people to collaborate with in our city, we're usually able to find a way to kind of shoot the gap and still make something special. Here's an overall image of that project, which for us, to kind of go back to the vernacular that we talked about at the beginning, is a great overlay of this customization with a building that really relies a lot on the common sense that you find in made buildings. Regardless of how complex our work gets, we still rely on just the most common materials, metal, wood, masonry, and on people who've dedicated their lives to building. We are a design-only firm. So we do work with contractors in our city and subcontractors in our city to do our work. And we've really had to figure out what the limitations and opportunities are of working in Raleigh, North Carolina. It would be really odd to give this talk without recognizing the other people in our office who help us make the work. This is an image of the 5 folks who are in the firm this summer. Brittany on the left was our summer intern. She's currently in Prague, which we're infinitely jealous of for a study abroad semester. Next to her is Jake, and in the back, looking super suave, is Zach. And then Aaron and I are on the right there, of course. We love this picture. My daughter took it at lunch this summer. There's a taco truck we go eat lunch at more often than we should, right near our office. My daughter took this picture, and it was kind of a surprise picture. We love it because Brittany is just looking super naive and happy. She has no idea what she's in for. It's a great image. Aaron and I on the right, we've kind of been through it. We know it's okay. It's going to work out. We're pretty happy. We can, smile for the picture. Zach and Jake just look highly distressed. You should know that Jake had just eaten a really hot pepper, so that's why his face is so jacked up. But in all seriousness, especially those two guys making the faces do an incredible amount of work. They're back at the office right now, towing the line while we're talking to you, and we're thankful for them. We've had about 9 full-time employees over the last 8 years, a handful of summer interns, and really the thing for us is just to set a tone of pointing the work in the same direction for 8+ years. Eventually, something good will come of that, and we're hoping that's the case. We've also, played a role in creating and been immensely helped by the community of friends and family and clients and collaborators and contractors that we work with. We always take time to celebrate. This is our 5th year birthday party, looking into our storefront. That sign is not photoshopped on there. That's actually on the window. I know it looks kind of weird. But we do always take the time to celebrate. If you're going to be in Raleigh on November 8th, we're actually throwing our 8th year birthday party. So please stop by. This was a fun event. The 5-year was probably the biggest party we've thrown. And there were so many people in our space. At one point, I looked around the room, and all the architects and engineers were standing on the edge of the room because you could feel the floor moving. It was really funny. Anyways, the most important thing about our work is it is not academic or primarily academic. We've actually gotten, in the last 8 years, 98% of the projects we've started have been built. Once we latch onto a project, it's definitely going to happen. And this has really made a big difference in our practice, just kind of the dedication to always figure it out.
So the second word we're going to talk with you about today is modern. It came as a pretty huge surprise to me, having grown up in Mississippi, school in Kentucky, and then moving over to little town Raleigh, North Carolina, that there was such a huge inventory of modernist architecture there. We have quite a robust history. In fact, we have more archived modern buildings, residential and non-residential, than any other place in the nation, underneath Los Angeles and Chicago, which is pretty huge. That's not to say that there aren't cities that have just as much or more. We just have a super huge cheerleader, lover of modern architecture who's made it his life's goal. His name's George Smart, in documenting all of this stuff and celebrating it. But you guys are probably familiar with some of these architects. So starting on the left is George Matsumoto. In the middle is Harwell Hamilton Harris, and on the right is Milton Small. And Matt mentioned Henry Kempfner having started the School of Architecture back in 1948. And that's really what began this whole era of having modernist architecture introduced into Raleigh. And part of that reason is because not only did Kempfner come and start a school, but he recruited some amazing architects, some of which you see up there, to not only teach, but he required them to practice as well, which is really huge, and it's become kind of a tradition now for architects. We have a huge adjunct faculty at NC State of practitioners, a lot of professors of practice is what we're called. So it's been pretty great to live, practice among this, and even had the opportunity to do some renovations on some of these kind of buildings. Something else that brought a lot of modern spirit to our city, Raleigh, is the creation of the Research Park, which is located in the middle of the triangle, so Durham, Chapel Hill, and Raleigh. That started to attract a lot of people from the Northeast and other parts of the nation who maybe were a little more leaning towards the aesthetic of modern. So to have them come in and then basically hire the architects, some of which you see up here, to work on some of their office buildings or private residences was really huge. And also what's really awesome about having the School of Architecture located in Raleigh that has this interesting value on modernist design is that a lot of people who go to school at NC State stick around and continue to practice, which is really wonderful. Matt did that, Zach has done that, Jake has done that. Hopefully Brittany will do that when she comes back. But what it means is that we often have precedents in that same vein of architecture and design that are from more nondescript architects, which is cool. So it's also meant that common development has been inspired by this over the years, which we're now a part of. These are examples of 3 firms that work among us. These are some of our colleagues who are basically fighting the good fight also to make our cities more beautiful. Raleigh Architecture Company is what you see on the left. Those are 2 houses called the Eden Twins on Edenton Street. They are a remarkable young firm. They're also design build. Which has been really fun to watch them kind of sprinkle these amazing gems of architecture throughout our city. And then in the middle is an up-and-coming firm called Vines Architecture. I believe you'll start seeing them on a national level, but they still have a vested interest in creating really good design in and around Raleigh and the Triangle. And then on the far right, I think you guys have heard from Tonic Architecture, Tonic Design and Construction in recent years. They've been around longer than we have, but they're huge heroes of ours, and it's really wonderful to practice in a city with so much talent. We also gain a lot of inspiration not only from each other, like I said, but also from people in other cities. So when we went we took our whole office, because it's not that hard to do, there's only 4 of us, to New York this summer for the AIA convention. And when we do things like that or go on retreats outside of Raleigh, we're sure to be inspired by buildings, certainly, the general fabric of the city wherever we are, but also by the architecture and landscape architecture firms that we either work with or highly admire. So these are a couple photos from that trip this summer. We're also, even though we're relatively young, we're also kind of old-fashioned in the sense that we have a library of books of precedents that we take very seriously and love sharing with clients to kind of get out of that only focusing on the internet for inspiration. And speaking of inspiration, Matt and I still, almost on a daily basis, refer to some of our mentors in the past. So this first one is Marlon Blackwell, who John mentioned is who Matt worked for in his younger years of practicing architecture. And I feel like even though I didn't work there, the intensity that Matt experienced there has kind of rubbed off on me a bit, and I feel like I have worked there. One of the things that I can say he's taught us is that it is actually possible to have a critical design practice and do critical modern work in a sustainable way. And most importantly, I think, especially for folks starting an architecture firm in the middle of a recession, he taught us that taking a risk is a good thing, and don't be afraid of that. Another huge mentor that we both share, we both worked together there for 4 years, is with Frank Harmon. And he's probably spoken here before, but you guys may be familiar with him. He's sort of a legend in many ways. But one of the things he taught us is the value in being good, not just different, and to really lean on the lineage of some of the architects and the traditions and the practices in the modern realm that we have in our space. We also share what we've learned through teaching and mentorship. We've talked a couple times already about NC State. And one of the things that's so great about NC State, in our opinion, is that it sounds negative to say, but we often describe the school as one that has its head stuck in the sand, in the sense that they're really, the way that they teach design is about focus on the ordinary and making the ordinary extraordinary. And there's a certain beauty in the immunity they have to fad. So what that means is that NC State churns out a lot of students who go into the practice really understanding how to design a competent building, but yet still having that modern aesthetic to it.
So from this context, heavily influenced by kind of this modern strain, our work is oftentimes just really direct. This is the plan and south elevation of the Corbett residence, which you've seen a couple of other times. It really is just a simple box. All of the support spaces, the bedrooms and bathrooms, are the exact same size as the main living space. And the plan's simple enough that even like a control joint in the garage is kind of a big move in the drawing. There are more images of that same project. This is, the idea that a building can be a very simple backdrop for life. The image on the right is one of our favorite images that we've ever had taken of our work. It's of Jamie Corbett sitting in our living room. You can see trees in the foreground. You can see Jamie in her house. You can see trees in the background. And the building really does nothing to get in the way of that. When the design becomes more complex, as it sometimes does, pictured here are the plan and section of the Yamato Philbeck residence, which is still under construction. Those complications are always the direct result of some response to the site or an experience. In this case, the house sits on a really normal-looking suburban street, and the site provides this amazing surprise. If you walk into the trees, pretty quickly you're faced with this 100-foot drop-off, which we don't have many of in Raleigh, into a valley that's filled with a beech forest. And the house really tries to amplify that experience, entering on the lower left through that portal you can see here under construction and moving diagonally towards that view. The other thing we've done in this space is in a house that appears to be a really kind of quiet one-story volume from the front, there's actually a 28-foot tall space inside where the stair sits under a skylight that pops up. So that idea of surprise and really making the most out of a modest budget and a modest scope of work is something we're always trying to do. In the end, we hope our projects are just well-composed accumulations of the most common materials of sheetrock, wood floors, normal domestic windows, and that all of our projects, we hope, have a really clear attitude about structure and about place. These are images of the Clark residence. And the image on the right is the living room of that house. It's where we spent all the money, as you can tell. And it's a living room and dining room that's just open to a really beautiful part of the site where there were 3 large white oak trees. We've had the opportunity, thankfully, to work at a larger scale and to work in even more challenging contexts than single-family projects. This is another image of the row house project that Aaron talked about earlier. It's the 10 at South Person. And really rolling up our sleeves and figuring out how to get a good result out of a very speculative environment where maybe the client and the contractor don't have the same will to produce something wonderful that we have on some of the single-family houses.
And we've also had the opportunity to recover some significant modernist structures. I know we shared with you before us breathing modern life into a historic residence, but this is one where we were actually recovering it's not even by a well-known architect in the city, but certainly inspired by some. And we had this amazing client who really decided that he was going to bring it back to what it was originally, all the way down to the furniture he selected for this. And he remains to date the only client we've ever had who allowed us to remove heated square footage in order to revive the carport that you see on the right-hand side. That was when he bought the house, it was closed in and made into this really awful den space that is much better for what it is now. And right now, this is a new project in our office. This is also the opportunity for us to breathe life into this modernist home. This is the childhood home of James Taylor, actually, and it's located in Chapel Hill on 24 of the most beautiful acres that I think exist in our Triangle area. And so this will, once it goes through its renovation and a little bit of an addition, that it's going to be lived in mostly full-time by 2 art collectors from New York City, which is pretty great. We're also finding over the last year or two, we're moving into more demanding types of work, in the sense that moving out of the residential and into the smaller scale commercial institutional. This is a project that we've been working on for the past year. It's very small. It's actually smaller than a lot of our residential work. It's only about 1,500 square feet, but this is for the North Carolina Museum of Art. And they have this art park, which is pretty unique for museums. It's one of the largest art parks, I think, in the nation, 164 acres of art sprinkled through, and greenways and streams and things like that, but nowhere to go to the bathroom. So we're doing the bathroom building, and it sounds like it's kind of a boring building, but we fought really hard to get this project, and we're super honored to have it. It's going to be our most exposed project that we've ever had. But
It has to go well.
It has to go well, yes. So it's got to be durable, and it's not lost on us that we're kind of following in the footsteps of other architects who've worked on the campus, such as Edward Durrell Stone, Smith Miller Hawkinson, and Tom Pfeiffer. So the pressure is on, but we've been having a whole lot of fun with it, working in this context. But still, we have that same sensibility of straightforwardness in our design, even for projects like this. We're always seeking to find the marriage between function and site and form, and most importantly, surprise. Even though this is small scale, we know it's going to have a really huge impact, but we're really excited. And hopefully this will start construction in the middle of next year.
Too soon.
Yeah.
So the third kind of topic we want to just reflect on a little bit is the idea of the make-believe. This collection of images, there's actually 2 collections of images here. On the left is a kind of screenshot from a typical MLS listing right now in Raleigh, North Carolina. On the right is a Pinterest page. I think I Googled California Modern or something like that. And you know, the first thing we want to talk about here, first kind of lens to look at make-believe through, is just to talk a little bit about the make-believe culture that we work in, especially as primarily residential architects. On the left, these images really are very, very similar to what most of the building in Raleigh, North Carolina, in the Triangle is right now. We have right now over 5,000 people moving to the Triangle every month. We have 800 new house permits pulled every month. And the amount of money invested in residential building in the Triangle is over $300 million every month. So there's this incredible tide of growth in our city that really, from our perspective, is impossible to resist. One of the hardest things about this is that the average cost per square foot of this residential work is around $90 to $92 a square foot. And so there's kind of this make-believe world that we live in where everyone is told that they can have a lot for nothing. On the right, the images from Pinterest are very similar to a lot of the images that our clients will bring to us at the beginning of a process. And these clients, who are otherwise wonderful people and are just doing research, really, when people find these images online, there's kind of this weird assumption that because you can find a picture of it, you can have it. And it is presented to us usually without context, with no understanding of the climate that the building is in, with no understanding of the process that was required to make it, and with no understanding of the cost required to make it. And so even our own clients oftentimes kind of come to us with this kind of make-believe context. So we find that those 2 extremes, the kind of you can have everything for nothing and everybody can have California, are kind of it's the space we work in, where we work. So we've had to kind of scramble to figure out how to do some pretty interesting projects. This is one of our first projects, the Chasen Residence, which was done, it's a first home for a young couple, and it was done with literally the most basic materials that you could ever imagine. Hardy panel, concrete block foundation, vinyl windows, an asphalt shingle roof, sheetrock, plywood floors, subway tile, but finding a way to still use those same pieces, the pieces you might find in like a fifth ring suburb speculative development, to make a light, airy-filled space. Again, the Corbett residents will oftentimes rely on an extreme simplicity of form to allow middle-class clients to afford a modernist aesthetic and to be able to focus, instead of kind of a grotesque accumulation of form, on a quality of materials. We've even worked in what you might call enemy territory in HOA neighborhoods, where you have to find a way to bait the logic of the HOA, and really where you have an opportunity to offer a counterpoint to the way most houses in those neighborhoods work. This is the Mora residence, which is one of our favorite houses we've worked on. It's interesting in the particular neighborhood it's in. It's the only house that doesn't face the street. It turns its back on the street and instead looks into an incredible view into the woods. And from a HOA committee and a community that at first were really bothered by the fact that this house is being built in their neighborhood, they've since told our clients that it's actually their favorite house in the neighborhood, and they come over all the time. And then also just having to work in a speculative environment on larger projects, like, again, this 10 at South Person. This is the only project where we usually kind of share the cost per square foot, because it's still shocking to us that it happened and that the team was able to figure out. The total amount of money for this project was around $116 a square foot. That included our fees, realty fees, legal fees, the cost of the land, site development, and building the building. And it was a really hard place to work. It was the first time we had worked in that environment. And honestly, we just ended up donating a ton of time living on site, making sure it worked out well, because it had to. But finding a way, which is really just being dedicated to it more than anything else, to produce something wonderful in the most banal context. And then kind of also finding a way to take these kind of Pinterest images and mold them to our environment. These are two projects that were done about 2 or 3 years ago. One's the Medlin House on the left, and then the Taylor House on the right, which you saw earlier across the pond. But this idea of this kind of clean modernism that doesn't necessarily belong in North Carolina, but finding a way to still do it and deal with water, which is a big problem where we live, deal with topography, which is a big issue where we live, and still produce something that's wonderful.
The second make-believe lens that we wanted to share with you today is with regard to context. This could be anywhere, but this is actually in Raleigh or in the Triangle area. And we all have snippets of this in our cities. I'm sure you guys experience the same thing, and therefore have that same challenge of overcoming that lack of meaningful context. And what do you do to fight the generic response to these things? So we have found in our practice, as I'm sure many of you in the room do too, that you kind of have to craft your own context. Matt sort of described on that, how we've responded in some of our design work with that. But basically finding the best we can in each site, even though this is oftentimes a lot of the general energy of what we see and experience. On the left is the Mora residence again, where, as Matt was saying, it kind of turns its back on some of what we would call the bad parts of the neighborhood or the site, in order to really embrace the good parts. You can sort of see a traditional house peeking into the photograph on the right-hand side. And the other image is of the Trull residence. This is kind of these clients really loved modernist architecture, and they came to us and asked us to design a house for them on a corner lot in this neighborhood that is one of the most uninspiring neighborhoods that we had ever encountered, full of trailers, actually, and also a lot of unmaintained 1980s housing stock. So it was a real challenge to try to figure out how in the world we can capitalize on the best parts of that site, but we'll show you a picture in a moment of what we did with that. But also make-believing context in the urban setting. So this is the Church on Morgan, that project that we shared with you earlier on, whose sanctuary was in an old garage space. But this is the outside of the building. There's a lot of new development, obviously, happening around downtown Raleigh, but a lot of the private developers are focusing on edge-to-edge development and not leaving space for the public. And most of this already existed in this fabric, but we we kind of embellished it with some of the social spaces that we began to design into this. And then on the right is the Braun residence in a neighborhood it's an okay neighborhood, but it's uninspiring in the sense that there's a lot of tear down and then refilling those spaces with McMansions that you see off to the right. And what you see on the left, it's kind of hard to point out. That's actually one of the original houses exists there, a tiny 700, 800 square foot house that has an RV parked in it that's actually bigger than the house, we think. But this whole idea of, in this make-believe context that we're trying to capitalize on the best parts of the site while also trying to strike a balance in scale and aesthetics and attitude when you're oftentimes literally stuck in the middle of these two dynamics. These are a couple projects. This is Jubala, again, who's the coffee shop that's located just across from NC State. And the context that it exists in is in the base of an aloft hotel, which, as we all know, is basically a kit of parts that it's inspiring in some ways, but it could be a lot more. And so, it's a pretty generally boring space, but we tried to really breathe some new, interesting life into it. And then on the right is the Troll residence that I mentioned is in the neighborhood of trailers and 80s homes, where we did find some good views and some good trees that we really turned the house to in order to capitalize on those views. And something over time, we didn't realize we did this. This is one of the weirdest houses we've ever designed. This is for a guy named Scott Shackleton, who's a local developer and lover of architecture and good design, and owns a bunch of property in a historic neighborhood. And this is on a really long, thin site, probably the longest, skinniest site we'll ever work on. And so what we love about this is at the end of the day, we kind of celebrate the fact that we feel like this house in particular begins to be this backdrop for the existing context, and it actually highlights some of what's charming about the context that this particular project is in. And then this is that Troll house again. So moving on to interiors, like what I'm sure many of you do, we really focus a lot on orchestrating interior spaces to create reprieve from some of these contexts and really connect the people that will live in these projects to the best parts of the site and shield them from the worst. So in a sense, the attitude we bring to the design of our spaces, especially the interiors, is that we're trying to really carve out sanctuaries for people, whether it's in the most dense context where you literally have a house that's about 10 feet away from you, but you're making a space that needs light and needs to share that. Or a couple spaces we have make-believing a world that's quiet, restrained, and what we hope for is beautiful. And this is a project whose stair on the interior you've seen before that Matt explained to us. But this is located also in a neighborhood that's pretty banal, has some 1950s, 60s stock homes, but it was a house that was in bad shape that we had to remove and replace it here. So again, trying to find the elements of surprise in each site, no matter how inspiring or not inspiring, which is usually the case, we might be faced with.
So the last lens we want to talk about make-believe through is just to talk a little bit about our process. And we have tried to save some time for questions at the end. I know probably some of you have to get back to work, but if you can stick around, we'd be happy to take any questions. So this last idea is just to talk a little bit about our process. And since you're all architects, you know this, but the process of being an architect is an act of make-believe in the first place. The image on the left is an image of a bear. Which you actually saw earlier in the picture of Marlon Blackwell's office. If you've ever heard him speak, he has an amazing bear story where he actually wrestled a bear, and I won't give away the punchline. I don't know if the story is true. Doesn't matter. It's an amazing story, and for us, that kind of idea of having a story is something that we look for in every project, and in fact look for kind of in our office. But the way we start our work is we all, it's easy because there are only 4 of us. We usually all visit the site. We don't typically have an idea at all for what we're going to be doing or an agenda for what we're going to be doing. We've typically met our client. We've gotten to know them a little bit. And this first site visit is really a pretty magical time where all of us are kind of doing sketches and talking. We usually, kind of adjourn to the office eventually and get a little more serious on top of a survey. But really looking for that story and imagining what can be on a site. We also try to listen a lot more than we talk about work and about architecture with our clients, with contractors, with collaborators. We really have learned that if you listen and come to each project open, really kind of as naive as possible, we've learned that there's an infinite range of possibility. One of the things that's happened over the years is we've started to talk to clients about our process and become more comfortable with it, or potential clients when we have those early conversations, is that we have kind of a weird sales pitch. And this is a little bit of a spin-off of a comment we've heard another architect make. In the end, the first thing we have to tell them is that we're not very good at what we do, because every project is completely new and we're going to do something completely different. We also are going to be pretty slow because it takes a lot of time to do good work. And in the end, we really have no idea how it's going to turn out because we're really interested in listening to you and listening to the site you're working on and kind of figuring out what can happen. It's a weird sales pitch, but it really is central to the way we work. We try to remain as naive as possible when we approach each project. Our process also constantly bounces back and forth between the make-believe and the real. We're always searching for the ideal, for the diagram on the site, for the way that things can be connected indoors and out, for that really kind of clear idea. And then obviously you're always testing through making. We have more models than we know what to do with. We've actually had to start trashing some of them, sadly. We do play favorites where we keep the ones we like and get rid of the other ones. But that kind of process of bouncing back and forth from the make-believe to the real is central to our process. And then again, of course, the kind of reset button of being engaged at the university and going up to the school and really teaching other people to kind of sustain their disbelief and pursue things that are clear and beautiful and not just things that are functional and known. The other thing we do a lot of, and this image on the right really kind of talks about that, is we mentioned a little bit earlier, is we do travel a lot. We had the opportunity 3 years ago to go to Germany and visit Zumthor's Columba Museum. That's an image of Zach and Mary, who worked in the office at the time, looking up into one of the amazing light monitors that Zumthor made there. But just really taking the time to go visit good architecture and see that it's possible and try to understand how it's made. It's something we take the time to do. We do a yearly retreat in our office, and just to kind of give you an idea of how committed we are to this year's retreat, we didn't rent a space and have a meeting. We all piled in my big Volvo XC90, left at 6:30 in the morning, drove up to Richmond to see Stephen Hall's new building up there, met with a couple firms, ate some great food, drove over to Charlottesville to see W.G. Clark's work in Charlottesville, met with some firms, ate some great food, and then drove back and got home just before midnight. Along the way, we had an agenda, we talked, we still accomplished stuff, but we really all wanted to see the work.
Wasn't much of a retreat.
Yeah, it was actually more stressful than the normal workday. But in the end, this kind of belief in the make-believe is really, we kind of really adhere to this, hoping that our version of the make-believe, instead of being an accumulation of expected things, like the image on the right, that you don't have to pay much for, instead we hope that our work is kind of the unexpected, and that instead of telling everything about what the market wants, we hope we're asking questions and that we make spaces that make other people ask questions. And that's it. If you guys have any questions, we'd love to answer them. I forgot so many things. Or you can all leave.